Hello, hi there. Thank you so much for joining us at the Edinburgh International Festival, but at home. My name is Jess Brough. I am a writer and a producer and the founder of an initiative called Fringe of Colour, which currently has their very first online arts festival, Fringe of Colour Films, happening at the moment. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here to be chairing a panel on artists in the age of COVID, speaking specifically on power and what power really means to art and institutions. And I'm joined by an incredible panelist, a panel of speakers, which I will be thrilled to introduce in just a moment. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment to say thanks so much to our BSL signers. We've got Jill Woods and Nicole Murdoch, and then on captioning, we've got Trisha and Orla. And we wouldn't really be able to do an event like this without them. So thanks to those four for being here. So how have power dynamics in the arts been exposed and exacerbated by coronavirus? This panel explores the Black Lives Matter movement in the arts, the challenges of representation in the UK, the US and Germany, and how do we design a more accessible system for the future? So we're really looking positively ahead in this panel. And I think this discussion, it comes from a place of looking at what's been going on in different arts institutions around the world since coronavirus. That's really shown up a lot of inequalities in the ways that things have been run, who has been left disempowered by this pandemic, and who has been disempowered in general even before all of this happened. And so joining me on this event are 5 people who occupy different institutions in the art world, who all have incredible insights into how to dismantle these power structures that we have so constantly addressed but still seem to be stuck with. And so the first person I'm going to introduce is Alice Sheppard. Alice took her first dance class in order to make good on a dare. She loved dancing so much that she resigned her academic professorship in order to begin a career in dance. She studied ballet and modern with Kitty Lunn and made her debut with Infinity Dance Theatre. After an apprenticeship, Alice joined Axis Dance Company, where she toured nationally and taught in the company's education and outreach programs. As an emerging and Bessie award-winning choreographer, Alice creates movement that challenges conventional understandings of disabled and dancing bodies. Engaging disability arts, culture and history, she's intrigued by the intersections of disability, gender and race. So welcome, Alice. And then I was going to say to the left, but I'm not sure whereabouts on the screen this would be. But next we have Mikey J. Asante, East London-born Michael is a producer, composer, singer, dancer and DJ whose 20-year career history is firmly etched into the UK urban music industry. As a co-founder and co-artistic director of hip-hop dance theatre company Boy Blue, Asante is credited with the direction and composition of Red, Outliers, Black, White, Grey, The Five and the Prophecy of Prana, Touch, Legacy, Pied Piper, A Hip-Hop Dance Revolution, and the film Rebel, or R-E-B-E-L. As a music producer, Mikey has created music for films, Street Dance 3D and All Stars, and enjoyed session work and production for artists including Delilah, Riley Ritchie, Estelle, and George the Poet. So really wonderful to have you here as well, Mikey. And then next joining us in a really special capacity is a duo. We've got Çağla Ilk and Misal Adnan Yildniz. Çağla works in theory and practice at the interface of architecture, fine arts and performance. She was born in Istanbul, studied architecture at the Technical University Berlin and at the Mimar Sinan University in Istanbul, and until recently worked as a dramaturg and curator at the Maxim Gorki Theatre in Berlin. And Misal studied psychology in Istanbul and later completed his master's degree in visual arts and image theory And from 2006 to 2008, he completed the Curatorial Studies program and was a fellow of the Swedish Institute and worked with Swedish Arts Grants Committee's International Program for Visual and Applied Artists. And in a moment, I'm going to ask the two of them a little bit about why they've come as a duo and talk about the institution that they're doing that in, because it's really interesting, a really interesting approach to work. And I'd love for us to speak on that a little bit more. But before I do that, we've also got Helen Marriage. Helen is the director of Artichoke. It's a bit hot here, so everything's a bit of a mirage. At the moment. Anyway, Helen is the director of Artichoke, the arts production company she co-founded with Mickey Webb in 2005, and creative director of Galway 2020 European Capital of Culture. Helen's previous work includes a 7-year period as director of the Salisbury Festival, described by the Times as a miracle of modern British culture. She created the first arts and events program for Olympia and York, the developers of Canary Wharf in London, and was an associate director of the London International Festival of Theatre. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about your work. And just to sort of ease ourselves into the conversation a little bit, I wanted to kick things off by asking you all what the concept of power means to you. I mean, it's a broad question, and maybe it's potentially not an easy question. But what are your first thoughts when someone says the word power? And I'd love to start with you, Alice, on this one.
Good morning. I'm Alice. I am currently seated in the land of the Moetma Ohlone in the state currently known as California. I'm a light-skinned multiracial Black woman with a gray top, a white wall behind me, and some art. I'd love to start by saying that power, in this context, power structures the things that become normal to us, the things that become invisible to us. Power is the thing that makes everything seem unrecognizable. The things that we know by our guts are structured in relationship to power. Power is what makes equity a single issue when actually it's an intersectional issue. Power is what elevates single artists versus communities. Power is what defines this question of representation and inclusion. I mean, the fact that we're even talking about inclusion versus equity already is a question of power, because it delineates who needs to be included and who is already, in the included room. So power is what structures our normal.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Alice. I have many things that I want to pull out from that, but just before we do, I want to ask you, Mikey, what do you think of when you think of power?
Interestingly enough, it's crazy because it's not so palatable to me. It's actually something that they have and something that I don't want. The concept of leadership and the idea of leading, I have no problem taking up that mantle, because for me, it's something that you do with a set of skills and talent that you have. If you've got an opportunity to help develop and push things forward, that's important to you and important to your community, then you should do it. But the idea of having power to kind of hold it, wield it, use it to kind of do something, that's never ever been an interest of mine. It's always kind of been this concept that's so far and over there. It's something that they have, and I just have what I do and what I must do as an artist and as an individual on this planet.
That's really interesting, the idea that power is something that they have rather than yourself or myself. And we're going to come back to that as well, as I say. But before we do, Çağla, what are your first thoughts on power? Or perhaps Çağla and Misal, if you feel like answering that question together, that's absolutely fine too.
Misal, if you allow me, I would say just one thing. When I think about the power, where I started talking about the power, was the first sentence in English was "all power to the people," which very moved me when I was 16, 17. And So all power to the people, the slogan of giving the power to the people, which was the kind of the attraction why I started also getting into the thinking of fighting for the hegemonies and get inside these hegemonies, understand hegemony and kind of tear it down. So that was my first thought when I was a teenager. So the art.
That's brilliant. Thank you,
I mean,
Çağla. And Misal?
I'm one of those people who kind of code things. So power, maybe we can have 3C, like control and capability and the capital. So all of them are somehow related with representation, and especially working with someone in the visual culture as an Anatolian queer mind, I would love to quote Paul Preciado, especially this amazing text from the letter from a trans man to the old sexual regime. It says very briefly, representatives, women and men of the old regime, come to the grips of your shadow side and have fun with it, and let us bury our dead. Enjoy your aesthetics of domination, but don't try to turn your style into a law. And let's fuck with our own politics of desire, without men and without women, without penises and without vaginas, without hedges and without guns.
I mean, if we could just do that for the whole discussion, I think I'd be, I think I would be pretty good.
Paul,
Thank you for that. And
thank you,
Helen, how
Paul.
about you?
I
Helen, what are
guess I
your
don't
first thoughts?
I don't think of power as a thing, as a noun. I think of it as a verb. And I think the question of who has power and who doesn't have power in terms of their ability to change things is what this conversation, I guess, is all about. So for me, power is not something that somebody else has and I don't have, or it's actually about recognizing your own capacity and the capacity of your community to move things along, to actually shift the DNA of the place that we're living in so that there is more equity. But I don't think of it as an abstract thing. I think of it as a way of promoting change, adaptive change, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking about it as from the very, very basic physics I remember from school and thinking about energy and the transference of energy, that's kind of how I sometimes think about power. And Alice, I think this question comes specifically from my own curiosity as somebody who is in academia and somebody who's also straddling that line between the creative arts. And I know that your journey has involved that in some way. You know, you were about to take on tenure as a professor, and then you left that to do what you're now doing, which is brilliant. And I'm wondering, do you think that there's more movement of power in the creative arts compared to something like academia? Was that at all a reason for your move? Did you feel like there was potentially more that you could do in dance?
Thank you for the question. I jumped. Well, maybe wheelied or whatever it is you do in a wheelchair that might be a jump. I jumped. I leapt from academia to the arts because I understood very clearly that the work that I could do would be different, and that the direct impact of my art would be different. And because I understood that there was a kind of urgency that I felt physically to live in and be in that I couldn't at that time detect in my academic writing. Now I have a much more balanced career and way of working in which my scholarship and my writing and my dance and choreography are deeply intertwined and in many ways inseparable. But at the point that I made the leap, it really was because I understood the urgency of the body much more powerfully than I understood the urgency of the word. So that was my thinking then. Obviously, things have grown and changed since then. And also, I recognize that I'm coming from a different culture and based in the US, and the way academia and the arts work together there is very different from the way they work together in the UK.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. I mean, it's so interesting thinking about what you're providing to the world while you're here and what kind of changes you can make. And it's something that I think about a lot in terms of research and art. And Mikey, I want to pick up on something that you said in your kind of introduction to my question on power. It's something that they have. And to me, that feels like what you're saying is that power is inherently negative. They being the people at the top who are oppressing those who do not have the power. And I'm wondering if you think that it's something that the more disenfranchised communities should be striving for. Should we be looking to get power in whatever way for ourselves, or is power the problem?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I look at it very, very differently, in the sense that a lot of these people who have the power haven't done a good job thus far. So there are ways and means in which we should be focusing our energy in a way that really kind of goes, that was the example of how not to do it right. So we should be focusing on how we can, as a team, as a community, build proper solid ideas that come from the people. I think that's the problem with political debate, so to speak. Currently, it's just spoken about by a certain section, especially in the UK, a certain section of society, as opposed to it being a homogenous thing that connects with everybody internally or externally, so to speak. And yeah, I don't see it anymore as the example of what we've done incorrectly, and I think COVID itself brought all of that out. It showed all these level of injustices on so many different areas. So like I think the NHS alone, just that as a thing, was so moving that a few months, or was it weeks before, they were talking about defunding it and taking stuff away. Then all of a sudden it became the most powerful and potent thing, and the thing we clapped for every Thursday at 8 o'clock for. It really kind of rebalanced. Wait, hold on. What is important? And where should we be getting our information? Where should we be considering how we consider the ideas of moving forward? So yeah, it's for me currently, what power looks like is just the example, and whether or not there's good things to grab from it or whether there's bad to kind of learn from. That's how I've kind of taken it, more of an optimistic approach, so to speak.
I love the optimism. I think that you can think about all of the issues we have in our various societies and institutions, and it can really weigh you down. I know for me personally, if I spend too much time dwelling on it, just emotionally, it gets really difficult. So yeah, thank you for that. And I would love now to ask you, Çağla and Misal, about how you can actively challenge these notions of power in terms of hierarchical power by doing what the two of you are currently doing. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your appointment as co-directors of this massive arts institution in Germany.
Maybe we can start. If you want to read this one.
Actually, it is a connection with also COVID-19, which is our topic. So social distancing was kind of an important term that we all shared during sheltering in spaces. And with Çağla, we developed another understanding of an institutional model. We call it institutional distancing. So through a review of institutional distancing, we propose a new format which doesn't reflect the systematic efforts and dictates of existing power structures. So we are taking responsibility through passionately responding and contributing to what it means to be contemporary, controversial, and critical. We don't legitimize our relevancy through conflicts, but are interested in taking appropriate actions toward resolutions. We are bound by a global emergency, but will head to safety locally.
And
So
do you think? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, please ask the question.
No, I was just going to sort of build on that and ask specifically, what is it about the way that these hierarchies work that you felt to be limiting?
So we should really specifically talk about then Germany, because Great Britain is very furthermore in this transculturality. Even though Germany has a very strong state funding in cultural and arts, the transculturality was not a theme till the 2005 and 6. And I'm coming from a movement which was named the Post-Migrant Theater, and that was the first time that we had the opportunity to establish something. So this is actually how, and Adnan was the director of Künstlerhaus Stuttgart, so he was one of the first persons who directed art institution. So that is actually unique in the contemporary art scene in Germany. We are the first ones for this level of institution commissioned, and we have both migrant backgrounds, and we don't belong to the high actually art scene. And it was for us a long journey, because it's like we were not only one, we were two. We had migrant backgrounds. I'm a feminist person and working very transdisciplinary, so they can't, and Adnan a queer person, and we are very thinking transdisciplinary. I'm coming from performance, Anna from contemporary art, so it was kind of a very big adventure that they have commissioned us. I'm very happy about that, and it was just before COVID. And it was just before the society recognized the cake is not there anymore. So we don't share the cake. So when we talk about the power, I always think about the German society, who is still keen on baking and eating or selling the cake all themselves. And we were just about to start baking the cake, and COVID came. So it's like also, I see this as an opportunity, because normally you have the big pressure when you establish something like this, and it's a state institution, so they don't let you, the hegemonies don't let you get so far. Now we are so far, so and many structures have failed during this transculturalization of the cultural establishments in Germany. So we can establish new futures and new strategies using the possibilities of the COVID, because normally you have the press power, you have the audience pressure, you have the production pressure. So it's time for us, I think for everybody on the world who is working in this business, to think now slowly about what we had been doing, and why we need to have a common strategy to change the structures and change the hegemonies. So that was our focus point when we started thinking about, do we need 10 solo exhibitions in the next 5 years? Or we need to reduce and think about producing or establishing a movement. It's who needs these resources? Where are the necessities? So it was kind of done by this idea of institutional distancing. We distance ourselves from the very high art world and establish kind of a new form of solidarity using the state structures, which is very, like, I can't say it's not like the Anglo-Saxonist capitalism hasn't dissolved the social state in Germany. We should always say that social state is still there. That's why the COVID has been kind of was not a very, very big failure for the health system for Germany. Kind of it was at the beginning a chaos, but then they immediately had the right reactions, and so also in the cultural in the policies, they have immediately established the different states, and the federal state, they've all established funding programs for the artists. So I should say, like, we are living in a kind of a country where they support the art and culture very much, but how they give a part of this in the power structures is very rare. So who goes there has to open the door and get it, the others inside. So I see ourselves also responsible for doing that. So maybe Adnan can continue on from this point.
That's brilliant. Well,
It's a
just before we
web.
hear a little bit more, from you, I just wanted to build off what Çağla was saying about change, and changing a space and an institution. And Helen, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the concept of change and whether or not it's possible to really uproot something as massive as an entire established art institution, or do we just have to find ways of starting from scratch? And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how Artichoke got started, and sort of how you've I'm going to go with it as a verb. How you've rethunk things since the pandemic, or even since the beginning of the institution.
So Artichoke is 15 years old and was started by me and my partner Nikki Webb, and wasn't intended to do anything other than present the work of the fantastic French theatre company Royal de Luxe, which I'd loved for 20 years and kept wondering why, if we're talking about power, why those in the big institutions, National Theatre, Edinburgh Festival, had never presented the work of this incredible company, which is uncompromising in the way that it occupies public space and will not compromise the show for the logistics. So the city basically, if you're going to do a Royal Deluxe show, has to turn itself over to the company for the period of the presentation, which is normally 4 days. Nikki and I set off on this journey, which lasted 7 years, to persuade the public authorities in London that you could close the public streets around Buckingham Palace, known as the ceremonial route, for things other than military parades, royal birthdays and weddings, government sponsored events, the marathon, sporting events that were all about winning things, that you could take the winning out of it and you could use those streets as a stage, and that there was artwork that was big enough, robust enough, powerful enough to occupy those streets with real grace. And as I say, it took 7 years for us to get the permission to do the show and to raise the money, which at the time seemed enormous. Now doesn't seem so enormous, but anyway. And it was very unusual for Royal Deluxe to be presented by individuals rather than by a city-state, so a mayoralty or something of that kind. Anyway, we succeeded in closing all the streets around central London for 4 days, which I think has never been done before or since, for an event that was a sort of piece of fairy tale magic. And the night before it happened, we were standing in the Mall, which is the road that links Buckingham Palace to Trafalgar Square, wondering if anyone was going to come. And on Sunday night, as the show closed, the BBC were reporting that there were 1 million people on the streets. This was 9 months after the 7/7 bombings, when people had been very reluctant to come out and share space with each other because of their fear. And it was just a huge triumph of art and imagination and joy and wonder, as opposed to all the things that we're normally presented with in those sort of settings where, you know, political demonstrations or all of those kind of things occupy our streets, but rarely are they used in that sort of magical way. So that was the first show Artichoke ever did. Funny to start a company and your first audience is 1 million people. And we never thought, I never particularly thought, that we would go on to do other things. But I think the impact of the event was so huge that in a really rare move, the Arts Council came to us and said, if we gave you more money, could you keep doing things like this? And we sort of thought about it and said yes. Nothing we do is ever the same, apart from our Lumiere programme, which we do in Durham every 2 years. But in that 15 years, we've probably done 16 or 17 different projects, each of which are an occupation of public space and an invitation to the audience to either participate or witness something that is life-changing, transforming of their experience and their expectations.
That's amazing. I mean, it really, what strikes me in particular is the idea that art could be what makes people feel comfortable enough to come out again after this pandemic. I mean, of course, we've got the pubs, which are already bringing people out, but I mean, there's nothing like protesting for a cause that's important to you, but also coming out to see something as magical as this show, to really get you to face those concerns that you have. And oh, Helen, I think you're muted, so I'm not sure if you were saying something just now.
I haven't touched anything, so I think that this that we're doing tonight is an example of the great benefit of digital culture, and what's happened during COVID is access effectively to people and to ideas and new experiences. But there's something very remote about it. I can't feel everybody else in the room. I can't touch you, smell you. There's no, it's an isolating experience, although the access is undeniably great. But I think that post-COVID, what is going to be really important is return to live and return to live experiences for people, the unmissable moment.
And actually, just on that note, Alice, I'd love to bring you back into the conversation here, because something that's been a big topic of discussion has been the ability for online events and the virtual space to create greater access points for a wide range of people. And I know that disability arts is obviously something that you're very passionate about, but it's something that you don't talk about in isolation. It's very much a cross issue, an intersectional issue. And I was wondering if you might you might have any thoughts on how we think about disability arts in comparison to like the mainstream arts that we see much more regularly, and if the answer is to find that like slice, to find that position within mainstream arts for yourself and for the people that you work with and you advocate for, or should we be thinking about these other art forms as entirely separate institutions, entirely separate companies? And well, they are separate companies, but entirely separate art forms, because they use such different ways of moving and engaging with space. Yeah.
Without being obstructionist about it, I mean, how about if I say with all gentleness and respect, the question is a symptom of the problem? Simply that to recognize this kind of question of like, should we be included in the mainstream? Problem. Or is it a separate thing? Problem. Because that's the operation of power. That is power at work right there. That is someone from an external culture looking in and sort of saying, well, what do we do with this thing that I don't recognize, I don't necessarily fully understand, but I recognize it should be there. Okay, I've got one of these, make sure I've got one of those. Or is it its own thing? We keep it over. That's a recognition of the externality of power, and to use Çağla's word, maybe to think about the hegemony of performance as mainly white, straight, and non-disabled. How about we reformulate the question and we think about the positionality of the askers and the positionality of the recipients of the question.
Yeah.
I would sorry?
No, go ahead. That was just an agreement.
Oh, okay, cool. So I would want to actually look at disability arts and sort of say, okay, what are the stories that we are telling about this, and who's telling them? Is it coming from the disability arts community? What sectors of the disability arts community is it coming from? Which sectors have I presented? Where have I put them on my stage? Which sector, like who is on my board? Who is on my presenting team? Who is on my production team? And what am I doing to actually facilitate the growth of the work of the artists? Am I, in my presenting structures, am I limiting the interpretive capacity and the weight and meaning of the work by, say, consigning them to an inclusionist space, to the narrative of representation, and not allowing the full diversity of the question to materialize? So, for example, we're talking here, what does it mean to actually have accessible events? Have we achieved that? So for this panel, the answer might well be no. but it might be yes. But what does it mean even in the formulation of the question? And here I just added an interpretive gesture of like winding my fingers in and through and around my hair to think about the actual accessibility of the work and the panel. Where's the queerness? Where's the race? Whose race? Which race? And what power structures are we looking at in that question? I mean, before we even get to answering your question about how things appear on stage, and this is a long answer for which I'm deeply sorry, but maybe not all that sorry. How about stop, re-examine the structures, the infrastructures, the questions, and then move to the next part? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And please don't apologize for the long answer, because you've just articulated how I've wanted to respond to something like my own project, A Fringe of Colour, in terms of it constantly being put into this box of inclusion and diversity as something that is a part of festivals that already exist. And that idea that it's a part of or it's not a part of, I find swallows up the work personally. And yeah, just thank you for such a revealing answer. And Mikey, I was wondering, in terms of the work, I know that you have done some really incredible work with young people, and specifically Black communities as well. And I'm wondering if, since lockdown has started, if you found that being online, especially with young people, creates more of a interesting way to navigate structures that have excluded for so long. And I use exclude not for the hope of wanting to be included, but as a deliberate thing that has been put on people.
Nothing can beat, in terms of what we do in our work, as being connected and in the space, working with young people directly, because they feel the space so much energy. You also at the same time are able to respond in a more natural and more poignant way based upon what the needs and their requirements are. So, the online factor definitely has hit us hard in terms of just being able to do what the work really requires, which is, real contact. But on the flip side, interestingly enough, during the period, I created a piece of music which was called 30 by Thursday. And it was like a challenge to myself in order to make 30 tracks in 4 days, essentially. And what ended up happening from that is the work got taken up by some of the, because basically I did it, which was pretty crazy. But then at the same time, it brought an opportunity to not only hone my skills and help me kind of develop what I'm doing, but also the way I kind of did it, got it out in 4 days, then specifically sent it to 8 other artists who then responded to it. It gave us a new form and a new format of ways we can connect past COVID, past the opportunity of being stuck at home and being back in the space. The point is that we can't ever go backwards. Things are changed, and that's fine. We now have to connect with the fact that we have a new opportunity, which is to connect probably a little bit more than just being in the space, but actually in an international space. You kind of take the idea of what you're doing to see how you can maximize and enjoy the opportunity of working with people in that space. But the problem is, I don't think anything will beat that connectivity, and like what was said earlier, the idea of what will be live and what would be a real sense of this thing that I think we generally take for granted in some ways, even though, yes, the digital space has opened us up to so much more connectivity. It's like, when we get back into the real space, what's that going to be? And the thing for me is, I'm not turning my back on the digital aspect, digital opportunities, and the way that we will get the chance to I guess, extend our arms slightly, especially in the international sense. So all in all, nothing can beat the reality, but at the same time, I think we've increased, or at least had the opportunity of another arm.
Thank you very much for that. I think people are anxious to go back to, I hesitate to say some form of normality, because normality before COVID was not a fun place for a lot of people. but we are, sort of desperate to connect with each other again. And I wanted to give a little bit more space to the idea that you were talking about, Çağla and Misal, of being being new to an institution as migrants, as perceived as outsiders as well, in that space, and coming in with all these radical perspectives, coming in with, as you say, Çağla, your feminism and queerness and the refusal to accept what's been done. And I'm just wondering how you navigate any pushback that you've had, because I know you have had some, and how do you stay focused on kind of your vision while the powers that be are kind of trying to drag you down still? Because you seem so happy.
We were just discussing about it just before going on this discussion, like breathing, 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 and discussing. Because, I mean, if you are curating in Germany, most probably all the funding structure expects you to make projects about integration, migration, or whatever. So, German curators are allowed to think about abstraction or conceptual thinking. So, in this way, we are resisting against the structure through maybe our inspiration is nature, or our inspiration is our community. So we observe the benefits of seeding, planting, caring, nurturing, sunning, sleeping, watering, or cleaning. Mikey will understand exactly what I mean here, because this connectivity that he's bringing is so much about the community, and we are building relationships, and we are developing this. And in this way, um, there is one strategy that both Çağla, including myself, insist on. So we propose slowing down as an attempt of the synchronization of collectivity. So uh, let us develop together ideas, relevant tools, and new nervous systems for especially listening, hearing, seeing, and understanding each other with more patience, less dash, more conversation, less representation. And in this way, I think listening becomes an important space, as much as how silence becomes resistance as a kind of political tool, because both of us are very engaged with artists from Guatemala or Kurdistan or different parts of the world in terms of coming with indigenous cultures, especially New Zealand, Maori context, Bolivia. So our roots are more coming from all spirits and queer, Anatolian queer and Anatolian feminist. So in this way, uh, for us, staying here, working in Germany, and establishing an institutional framework means endless resistance.
It's a constant, as Angela Davis says, resistance is a constant struggle, and um, I can attest to that as well. Like, you're just having to constantly reinterpret things and reframe how you address issues, and it's quite exhausting, to be honest. But there's something that you had that I read in one of your statements, that, Çağla, I wondered if you could expand on, this idea that you don't legitimize your relevance through conflicts. And in a way, a lot of things that have been created in the last few months have have felt like they've come from conflict. We've got a conflict with our health and the way that our various governments have dealt with the pandemic. We've got conflicts that have led people out onto the street to protest for Black Lives Matter, and we've got conflicts, daily in all parts of the world. So then how does conflict inform your work, if it does? Do you find it guides your practices in any way, or do you come from a completely different angle? I think perhaps we have frozen with Çağla, but we can come back to that when Çağla reappears. Oh, technology. Misal, I don't know if you want to take that question for a little bit while
We,
Çağla
we
comes back.
share a lot of discussion about this, because the current power structures are actually not challenged by the conflict. They are fed by this conflict, produced by this conflict designs. And the way how conflict resolution operates is very much mimicking this power structure. So actually we both talk a lot about a term that interests us during this paradigm shift, continuous mediation. Because if you are part of a community, if you are building a community, if you are caring for relationships within a community, as a curator, as a director, as a cultural producer, inevitably your role becomes a continuous mediation.
Absolutely.
And
hopefully
besides this, you have to run a state institutions. Like it's like you have this whole the thing, and then we are also doing, and we share this one position. Like I'm always now making the joke. The previous director, former director, was from Denmark, and we replaced as two Turks, one Danish guy. So it's like taking always like there is kind of complicities. When he was doing, everything was fine, and when we try to do something, then it's like we should question it. So like it's an ongoing questioning, ongoing mediation, and besides this, you have to run an art institution. It's like everything is really but we are still not complaining because it's a chance.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a chance to change this way of thinking. We have now the chance to show kind of a new institution, which is not based on producing 3 solos from the high art and 4 group exhibitions from the other high art artists. So we can dream about a transdisciplinary, transcultural new forms of an institution. So it's like a kind of a bit we are very much talking about the future because we haven't started the program yet. It would be interesting to meet in 1 year and to rethink about after or mid-COVID process, how we have established, or maybe in 2 years, how we established to get inside of these hegemonies and to distribute the, I don't want to use the name power, but the resources, because we have now this resource, which is very important.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Oh, was that an extra? Well, I actually, one thing that you said, Çağla, reminded me of something that Alice, you said earlier in your first answer, the idea that we need to restructure our appreciation of artists beyond the individual. And I'm wondering how you see that happening. I mean, how do we go from, constantly celebrating one artist to a space where actually we're thinking about the production and the performance as a whole, because there are obviously so many people behind a piece of work. Is it that we need to entirely rethink our ideas of who's done the work or who gets to be celebrated?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really want to, again, work from the position of stop, and then maybe share a little bit of how we think about things, or at least how I'm thinking about things. There's no state funding here for the arts to speak of. Any funding that we get for the arts is from private foundations or from artists' own pocket. And so the world is very different. And what COVID does is reveal the extent to which there is no real social safety net. There is no funding, the inequity of that, of the world. And once the structures fall apart, the thing that's been really interesting to me is that the structures were never there. And what is shattered now is the veil that allowed us the illusion of structure. With that rend in the veil, the thing that has not gone away is the art. And in my practice, and in the world that I'm trying to build, the art leads. So the very first question is, what are the values of the work itself? How do the values of what you see on stage emerge from, or actually, let's ask the question the other way around. The values of what you see on stage emerge from the process of creation and they emerge from the organizational culture insofar as there is an organization. I mean, partly I want to ask, is this notion of organization actually needs reframing? This notion of company needs reframing. This notion of institution needs reframing. And so for me, in my practice, I am trying to build a simultaneous flow of equal values from administrative, artistic, and administrative process and performance as not being separate, as being one set of artistic and cultural set of ethics. So the art leads. And if the art leads, the questions become very different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even without funding, the things that people have been able to do in the last few months has been incredibly inspiring. And not even in the last few months, I mean, so many different communities still manage to come together and do something for themselves without that massive grant that's being withheld from them. And actually, Helen, I'd love to get your opinion on funding and financial assistance and the way that we currently, at least in the UK, you're laughing, because it's a system that works really well, isn't it? How do we, what do you need as somebody who puts on this amazing large scale work? What are you currently being given or asked for in terms of funding and support? And really, what is it that you need?
So, as you can see from my hair, I'm pretty old. I've been around a really long time, and I have never, in all my working life, and Artichoke certainly hasn't ever been asked to do something and then given the money that it is needed to do it. So we're in a constant scramble to raise the funds that allow us to produce the work on a scale that we're used to working on, but that protects the public, protects artists, allows the work to be robust enough to be seen by hundreds of thousands of people. So the costs for us, the strange costs that we end up funding, are huge amounts of things like traffic management and crowd control, all of that kind of stuff. It's really hard to go to a commercial sponsor or private foundation and say, actually, I need £200,000 to pay to close the street and control the traffic in central London. I mean, nobody wants their name on that particularly. So I think what's interesting about funding in the UK, and Alice obviously raises the issue of there being state funding. I mean, there is state funding, not in the way that there is in Germany and France, but there is some. But I think what's interesting about it, and we see it in the way that the emergency bailout funds are to be distributed, that it privileges institutions, I guess, usually building-based institutions, but institutions that are considered too important to let go, but doesn't insist that the funding that goes to those institutions is shared equitably with the workforce. So you have a situation where currently some of our national institutions are letting go their freelance and casual workforce at the lower end of their pay scales and their employment. And yet I'm sure we'll be given funds to survive through until, quote, normality returns. And that seems to me to be a very strange way to value the important thing about art and the creation of art, which is people, the people who make the work. And as Alice says, it's not a single artist who makes work, it's a community of people who work together, whether that's lighting and sound people or designers or choreographers or practitioners or musicians, or it's a big communal event. And I can't help but feel that COVID and the response to it has just reinforced the division between institution and non-institution. So, I mean, you might say, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because we've always sat outside the institutional structures, going our own way, really, doing the important thing for me when we produce an event is the ideas. It's all about the ideas. What is this saying? What are we saying to the public? Who gets to participate? How does this work? Um, and that is not anything that has been to date recognised as significant in terms of the cash it takes to make those events happen. So if you're going to entertain, as we did in that very first show, 1 million people on the streets, just the extraordinary amount of work that goes into making sure that that's a safe thing to do is something that is not really recognised as part of a sort of arts output, if you like. So I'm very concerned post-COVID, in the new world that we will all face, that there is an adaptation, that people change and that values change, that recognition is given to people and organisations and ideas that have been submerged to date.
I mean, that idea of hopefulness that something will be different after the pandemic is over is something that I wanted to ask you, Mikey, about. You know, we've had these last 5 months of you know, huge unrest. We've had people protesting all over the world. It's been amazing to see. We've had statues pushed into rivers and replaced and then taken down again. And we've had people demanding the abolition of the police, the abolition of prisons. These are conversations that some of us had been having before, but were kind of on the fringes. And suddenly they were on national TV, mockingly, but they were on national TV. And there was a period during, for me at least, during the earlier days of lockdown of hopefulness and thinking actually people are talking about these issues now and maybe we'll go somewhere. But it seems to have slowed, and the momentum has gone. And I just wonder, as someone who's been in the arts world for so long, how do you maintain your momentum and what you're doing? And you're thinking about the ways that you're affected by the music industry as a Black man, the ways that you're trying to work with kids from poorer backgrounds. I mean, how do you, knowing that things have not changed for so long, stay committed to that as a goal?
You know what was interesting with the whole BLM situation in the UK specifically? You ended up getting a lot of calls from people who all of a sudden just realized you were Black. You know, it was literally that crazy. It was like, I wasn't Black yesterday. These things have been happening. These things have been occurring. And the attitude that we have from a Boy Blue perspective is that we've never ever let the concept or the idea of any of these issues which have already existed, all of these statues were already erected before we were born. You know, I go back to, and I harken back to my original point of they had power. I was born into a space, into a world where individuals had already defined who I was as an individual. Yeah, it was already defined to me just because of the color of my skin. So that attitude puts you in a mindset and puts you in a space that you just have to go and get it. You have to create the spaces, you have to create the momentum, you have to create a set of a world for you to kind of operate in, to kind of allow other people, specifically, especially the ones after me, to grow and to build. So the attitude post-COVID, even though COVID has arrived, is like what has been said. It unearthed, it unveiled. But the attitude that we had already was the attitude we had to take into this new world. It's to get it done and to do it and move on your own volition, on your own power. Take that of your community, take that of what's happening amongst all of us. Because I mean, a basic way that we started what we did was there was a space. The space was £20. We needed at least £20 to get in. So that means we need 10 people at £2 to pay for that space. And that's how Boy Blue was born. That attitude has never ever changed, and it will never ever change, because the bottom line is we know none of these things will ever be handed out to us, whether it's funding. And as we stand from a Boy Blue perspective in the same space as Artichoke. We had done the work and the Arts Council came to us. And if you have attitude as, any kind of company, leader, artist, then you're moving in the right direction, because COVID has shown us that all of these structures, all of these things, all of these spaces that they said existed, a lot of it was a fallacy. A lot of it was a space that really didn't hold up and push what is really going on. So we have to continue with this fight. We have to continue with this push, and it's always going to be this way until we, as a collective community, find a way to kind of work it all out. So for me, it was spoken before about the fight and the push. You're always, as a black man, sitting in a space of offensive and defensive, and constantly pushing back and forth between that space where you're seen as a threat at times. So you have to put, your defensive on, and then you're seen as something that is going to damage something. Then you're going to have to put your offensive on. And that energy is constantly there. But you know what? It put me in a space of understanding the real nature of the world. Because as I said, I was not black yesterday. COVID didn't need to tell me, didn't need to tell us that these things were already wrong and they need to be sorted out.
Thank you for that. There's something that you said about, well, specifically, I love that financial model of saying, okay, well, this is how we're quantifying the value of this thing. How do we make that more achievable by spreading it between people? And Misal, I would love to ask you about Germany's relationship with the arts and capitalism specifically. I wondered if you were tempted to touch on this earlier by the use of comrade, but how do we move ourselves away from what I think is a very capitalist stronghold on the arts in terms of thinking about how much money people can raise from it, the tickets that we're selling, who's getting paid, again, the hierarchies of power and who's getting paid for what work. How do you face that as a new director?
I think it's not possible to understand Germany without referring to the term pedagogy. And my partner in crime, Çağla, would immediately remind us our strategy of dealing with this reproduction of the society. I mean, today with dearest Marisha Lewandowska from London, we were in a kind of corresponding communication. We were exchanging some insight, and Marisha brought a really, really important term from Audre Lorde, and this fits to Mikey's. What I wasn't a black man yesterday, today, tomorrow. COVID didn't change this. I'm always here with the same statement. Lord says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Of course, this is kind of looping back us to the reference to Paul Preciado, because Paul also reminds us there are no politics that are not body politics. So in this sense, my partner in crime, Çağla, always defines the frame of our institutional programming as gathering of the body. So maybe it is her who is going to open up, unfold this term, because I think in order to deal with the German system, not only with the funding system, also how what art represents, what art is expected to resolve, and what is the function of art in this society.
Perhaps, Çağla, you want to jump in
Bodies
there?
is a very complex structure, and I think it's an excellent strategy. So I would love that Çağla unfolds this term. What is it for us, Çağla? What does gathering of bodies mean for us?
That's what, always thinking about the funding and how we continue on further. COVID showed us the racial profiling is exactly a part of our society, which we experience very strongly after the COVID, even more. We experience you hear me?
Yes.
You're back again.
So I really wanted to question a word. I don't know if it was used in UK or in the other countries, but here the term system relevant was used to eliminate some people who had to go out or work or to get help in nursery as workers. So, and the artists were not system relevant. And so this getting the society into parts, like who is system relevant and who not, was kind of the pedagogy, was German pedagogy, what Adnan was talking about. I want to connect to this how the gathering of the bodies with our first statement. Like, if you can change, if you want to change the structures, you can't do it alone. So that's why we are 1+1. We are not 2. We are 1+1 plus and plus and plus. If you want to change, and not only in an institution but a structure, a hegemony, then you have to become kind of a moving river. So to become a moving river, you need the movement. To be the movement, you have to become a bigger body. And this body has to be actually established through this new alliances. So I see the people who are all talking in my digital screen now as comrades, because I really learned a lot from, I heard the simultaneous flow, I heard about the reframing structure, I heard from today, I'm not the black when I was yesterday, and I'm going to be. So these all the terms come to me, that how we establish, like, actually, if we want to change this world, we have to be all together, and we have to define these new strategies, how we fight for race, class, and gender all together. We can't do it without thinking intersectional. So we have to establish, like, I was very fascinated by the ideas of this tiling the hierarchies, which we also want to do. Like, everybody has to have kind of this part of this movement. We have to be a part of this movement. So it's about not getting alone to the power, but getting the power all as the people. So that's what I meant by the gathering and the collection of these bodies all together.
Thank you so much for that, Çağla. That was really insightful. And we've got about 5 or 10 more minutes left of the conversation. So I just wanted to give a little bit of space to our couple of audience questions. And Helen, I'm going to send this question your way, if that's okay with you. It's, how do you feel about the role of individuals versus institutions in relation to government support or rebuilding of the arts? And I suppose this question is of particular interest to me, as well as somebody who's part of a project that is almost entirely supported by donations from the public. Arts funding has been almost non-existent. So what do you think is the responsibility of the individual? What do you think is the responsibility of the institution in saving our arts world?
That's a complicated question. I think that I think when you look at the system in which Alice lives, as I understand it, that sense that private individuals have set up foundations and trusts that support the work of artists, that can seem like something that is very desirable, but the absence of state support for the arts, I think, is a terrible mistake. I think that the arts that our people pay for through their taxes has to be more equitably distributed. But what I really think, and this is probably not a super popular view, is that in fact, I hesitate to say it. There's a movement down here in England around the recognition of the creativity of everybody, that everybody is creative. And I completely agree with that. But I genuinely don't believe that everybody is an artist. I think that artists are very strange and wonderful people, usually quite annoying, but that they work in a particular way to reveal to us things about our lives, our society, or the complexity of the world in which we live that are apparent to them and only apparent to us when that revelation has taken place. So I think that in terms of supporting artists as key workers, if you like, structurally relevant, to use Çağla's word, I think that's something that we should really work towards, the recognition of the artist's place in society as a vital part of our communal experience. And therefore, I think that state support needs to go equally to big institutions, which you can look at as faceless, not in the case of Çağla and Misal, because obviously they're trying to humanify, make more human the institution, the Kunsthalle. But those institutions are very often made up of communities of artists, whether those are artists, technicians, whoever are working there, who have very specialist skills, are very professional in what they do. And so I think that supporting an institution can be a really valid way of supporting a community of artists, but shouldn't be done at the expense of emerging cultures, minority cultures, all the kinds of things that historically have been in the second division as far as access to resources.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think it's something that you were speaking about in terms of key workers versus, well, if you have key workers, that means you have people who aren't key workers. If you have people who are relevant, that means you have people who are less relevant. And unfortunately, through the pandemic and all of these jobs that have been lost recently and furloughed, we've seen a really obvious line between people who are considered key, people who are considered important for any workforce. And I'm specifically thinking about theatre, I suppose, and like those who have lost their jobs as front of house versus those who are still being commissioned to write scripts. But I think very tangentially that leads on to the second audience question that is sort of aimed at Alice and Mikey. They're asking if you could comment on power dynamics in relation to the body in a dance rehearsal or performance environment. For example, what is the role of a choreographer and a company? Perhaps, Alice, you can answer this one first, and then we'll go to Mikey.
We'd love to. So, I mean, I want to just sort of tie some threads together. First of all, artists here in the United States have not been defined as necessary workers. So we are not essential workers. We're not necessary workers like the rest of the world. I want to question the notion of work. Like, why do we have to work? Like, what is the notion of work doing with regard to funding? And that notion of who and what is work will help us understand what happens when we get to power dynamics in a rehearsal, right? So I can look at a dance rehearsal and as a dancer and as a choreographer, and not really, if we're not fully funded, if we're not there instructed, we're not thinking about the ways in which the work has to go really equitably in terms of, how do people get to rehearsal? When the work happens in the rehearsal, are there breaks? Are there time? Is there food? Is there access? If there is access, are we thinking about white access or intersectional access? Are we thinking about functional access or aesthetic and cultural access, which are two separate things? Are we focusing on the body and not focusing on the mind, looking at that hierarchy? Are we understanding how our interpretive practices shape, for example, some things that are known, recognizable as impairment or disability in white minds, but not in race minds in the US. Some things that happen we understand as a disability, but don't really understand as a physical disability, but don't understand how race informs that interpretive practice. If we don't have those things explicit, the moment we start talking about dance or movement, we are really, we're lost. We have to understand the whole thing from the notion of work, from the notion of capitalism, before we get to the notion of bodies. It does not make any difference to me if you have a backstage bathroom, because you should, and you have a ramp to the stage, because you should, if we don't have those other complexities and understandings in place. We are behind in getting ramps to the stage, et cetera, and getting interpreters and getting effective audio description. And those are first steps. They are necessary first steps. But you have to do the conceptual, abstract work behind it. Otherwise, just getting a describer or a BSL interpreter is not going to make sure that equity, which is not the same as equality, actually happens.
Mhm.
Okay.
Absolutely. No, that was brilliant. The other stuff, I guess, it would be like putting a plaster on a bigger issue. You know, it holds for a little while, but if you don't fix the underlying problems and lacks, then it's just we're gonna have these problems all over again. And Mikey, I'm wondering if you wanted to respond to that question that's specifically kind of about the body and
Yeah,
dance.
I only wanted to add because I think Alice, you know, she dealt with that question perfectly. But from a hip hop perspective and from our style perspective, I think the most important thing for us is uh, having everyone kind of look the same. Essentially, when we do our choreography, it is about how tight it is and how connected it is. So we move first place to training, and for us it's about getting everyone to a particular level. So making sure, for argument's sake, we got a move called a nip. That is like a standard move everyone should be able to actually perform. So it always boils down to our training, and we constantly look, because hip hop is a style. It wants you, it requires you, it needs your authentic self. So the beautiful thing about what we do in terms of our program is we're constantly looking for that spark thing, that style that you connect to, so that we can help embody and help you build that specific style. So it's never ever wanting, you know, we want as choreographer or company for you to embody. It's more trying to pull out the natural aspect of your skill set, and then wanting to build and train that aspect of you, because then you become a tool in the toolkit of making the final performance. So for us, more than anything else, it is more of a collaboration between, I guess, a dancer's natural spirit and space, and then at the same time trying to draw and help via, I guess, osmosis to build that individual up into the best version of themselves, from a technical aspect. But I mean, yeah, there is so many other things which take precedence, and I think Alice, she broke it down perfectly.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for answering all of those questions. I believe we are coming to the end of today's session, so you can take a deep breath. And just thank you as well for everybody who has been listening and engaging with the conversation. Thank you to our interpreters and our captioners. I also want to acknowledge that paying attention to a long online panel discussion is quite challenging. And so if, like me, you struggle to hold attention for this long, I urge you to go back to the YouTube video and kind of think about what's been said today, because our speakers have all said really interesting and just transformative things about the arts world. So thank you so much to all of our speakers, and thanks to the Edinburgh International Festival. Enjoy the rest of your festival experience.